districts.
I told you, Senator Powell, I drew blind to race. I would suggest to you that it's a very rich, diverse state, and there are minorities that live throughout our state, and we're blessed by that. I drew blind to race, so naturally there were going to be differences.
So it's just
state.
By chance or by coincidence that those Anglo-dominated Senate districts now see increases of minority voters.
I told you how I drew the maps, ma'am.
Okay.
The divided parts of Nueces County do not represent our county's racial breakdown as a whole and harm minority voters.
This proposed map in SB4 and the amended map that was sent late last night does in fact tear our community apart and dilute our voices. Currently, SD10 is the only crossover minority opportunity Senate district for Tarrant County, which, mind you, is the third largest county in the state. By dismantling this district, the committee has once again violated the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution.
Opinions to this process. I just have a couple of questions based on your testimony and your handout. First of all, I see one of the highlighted areas of your testimony that says the need to consider race and redistricting, and you've testified to that today. How do you square that, or is it your testimony that we should disregard the Supreme Court races which prohibit race-based districting unless we are shown a strong basis in evidence to believe that a race-based redistricting is required to comply with the Voting Rights Act, Section 2.
Instead, our draft maps pack and crack our communities and dilute our votes. I urge this committee to comply with the Voting Rights Act and respect the reality of the new census by allowing people of color the opportunity to choose the candidates of their choice.
As I look at the map, the attempt to tear apart Tarrant County's historic Latino communities that work together is evident. The entire north side is cracked in place in Senate District 9, and the south side Hispanic communities are no longer able to unite with their neighbors to the north and vote as a coalition to elect a candidate of our choice to the Texas Senate.
But Asians in North Austin are cracked into 4 separate Senate districts. Our maps are not reflecting the growth of minority communities and instead are dividing us further.
It's challenging to not conclude that this is an attempt at diluting our votes.
We are, to put it bluntly, horribly frustrated and disappointed, but not surprised in the way in which the white dominant political power in Texas is trying to retain and expand their political power at the expense of minority voters and minority citizens in Texas. When I say again, I'm talking about not just decades, but generations of consistent, illegal, racist, racially biased behavior.
Our approach to this process was informed by the redistricting jurisprudence from the United States Supreme Court, as well as other applicable precedent. Several key cases are worth highlighting. Abbott v. Perez, 2018 Supreme Court case. Cooper v. Harris, a 2017 Supreme Court case. They made clear that any redistricting decisions made on the basis of race must be narrowly tailored to achieve compliance with the Voting Rights Act.
One of the problems that we've heard before is that Texas has seen tremendous growth in the current census cycle. In overwhelmingly the population, over 95%, has come from minorities. The growth in the population has come from minorities. The proposed map does not reflect the growth patterns and in fact goes to extreme levels of gerrymandering to disenfranchise racial minorities.
But nevertheless, we are concerned that it would dilute minority votes, and here's why. 12 of those 16 precincts are heavily Republican. That's fine, but they're also disproportionately white. And so then we cut that central hole out of Nueces, and then we take a chunk of San Patricio to fill that hole. Well, and that piece of San Patricio is disproportionately white compared to the rest of their county.
District 10 is firmly established as a minority coalition, a crossover district where its citizens are protected by the Voting Rights Act and the U.S. Constitution. The proposed map intentionally, unnecessarily, and illegally destroys the voting strength of minority citizens and the citizenry of Mansfield. Your proposed map splits my beloved city into 2 Senate districts and intentionally dilutes the voting strength of our city, and in particular, African American and Hispanic residents, by submerging each part into Anglo-rule dominated districts.
The Fort Bend County POC population has grown to 60.4%. However, it has been redrawn to contain only 55.1% POC. The data clearly shows that my district is immensely diverse, but redrawing has now made it ever larger and barely contiguous in a clear attempt to dilute the power of minority votes.
As members of the Fort Worth City Council representing majority-minority districts, we write with grave concerns regarding the proposed Senate map, which cracks Fort Worth's historic and growing minority communities and places our constituents within Senate districts where their votes will be diluted and their voices stifled.
I said any adjustments that need to be made to SD10 should maintain the core of its current district and take in minority populations that are in far southeast portion of Tarrant County. Clearly, this request and requests made by numerous witnesses from Tarrant County were blatantly ignored. The proposed Senate map fractures my constituents who mostly reside in SD10 and will place them in 2 separate Senate districts where they will be unable to elect candidates of their choice. And with respect to the latest map that was proposed, there's no communities of interest with Fort Worth and those rural communities.
We did not consider race in drawing the maps at all, Senator Miles. It was not one of the considerations we used as you've stated, a community of color.
16. What has been proposed is literally a travesty. As has been said multiple times, this body has a duty to protect the interests of all citizens. Packing and cracking is not just wrong legally, it is morally wrong.
As our population has grown, we still lack adequate representation.
There are not people in this same chamber required you to pay $2.50 back in the 1960s to vote in the state of Texas. That was equivalent to about $20 today, so people could vote. And that was done intentionally to keep African Americans and Mexican Americans from voting at that time period. After that, literacy tests were passed in this chamber. Literacy tests said you had to be able to read and write to be able to vote in Texas. To give you an example, Mexican Americans in the Valley and in West Texas were asked to recite the Texas Constitution verbatim to vote.
Maps were drawn both from the congressional delegation, as I told that map was given to me, was drawn race blind. Any work we did on them was race blind, but they have been determined to be compliant under the Voting Rights Act.
Communities of color are the driving force behind growth in Texas. 95% of our population increase was due to African Americans, Latinos, and Asian American Pacific Islanders. We deserve to be fairly represented in these maps because it's the right thing to do. But it's also the law. I urge this committee to comply with the Voting Rights Act and respect communities of color's protected right to choose the candidates of our choice. The proposed maps do not allow any minority opportunity district.
Creating so-called race-blind maps cannot protect Texas from liability under the Voting Rights Act. There are a whole bunch of reasons why, but I'll touch on 2. First, redistricting is never really race blind. Pretty much everybody here is sophisticated enough to know where the Latino and African American as well as Asian American population is growing and concentrated. And so it really isn't possible to sort of unknow so many of the things that people know when they're drawing maps about people of color. Second, and Michael Lee made this point, we are seeing legislatures around the country consider not turning on racial shading in GIS programs as creating a type of safe harbor for them in terms of legal claims that that may be something that they want to try to do with respect to intentional discrimination claims, but it does not protect you from claims of affects vote dilution under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Secondly, I'd like to address the districts themselves. Their creativity with which the outlined Senate districts is extremely concerning. The proposed maps, once again, have no interest in representing the people of our state. Instead, their main concern is maintaining power, even if it comes at the expense of our democracy. The ultimate outcome of the map is obviously designed to decrease the number of competitive seats, ignore the growth and influence of the communities of color, and gerrymander our districts once again. It's clear that community input during the few redistricting hearings that did occur, including my own, simply requesting fair and competitive maps were not met.
I remember sitting in my college classroom in 2015 and learning for the first time what the term gerrymandering meant. The following year, I went on to write my honors thesis on why half of all eligible young people, despite being the largest eligible block of voters in United States history, decided to stay home instead of voting in one of the most critical elections in our lifetime. The answer I came to over and over in my year of research was that young people were made to believe that their votes did not count. They didn't matter. They truly believed that the elections were decided for them, and their voice and their vote didn't make a difference no matter what they had to say.
Well, as I've stated very clearly, these maps were drawn blind to race.
I currently reside in Euless in Senate District 9, which based on the 2020 census data has grown to 61% of the people of color. And these proposed maps have been redrawn to include less than 50% of the people of color. These proposed maps are splitting and erasing our voices district by district.
Since 1970, 1980, 1990, 2020, 2010, LULAC has filed a lawsuit against every redistricting plan in Texas history. In every case, LULAC has prevailed. In every case, we were able to show intentional discrimination. And let me tell you why I believe we'll be able to show intentional discrimination once again.
The census showed that 95% of all growth in Texas occurred in the African American, Latino, and AAPI communities. Any fair map must reflect the diversity of the state. But instead, the new maps pack and crack our communities and dilute our votes. I urge this committee to comply with the Voting Rights Act and respect the reality of the new census by allowing people of color the opportunity to choose the candidate of their choice.
I was a young lawyer, young barrister who practiced in the court of Judge Lee Duggan in Houston, Texas. And Judge Duggan called me to the bench once. We were litigating a case. The facts are not important. But what he said to me was, and the prosecuting attorney, it's not enough for things to be right. They must also look right. And he said, because this doesn't look right in this case, the court is going to have to make a deeper inquiry. Some things must look right. Not enough for them to simply be right. And I would suggest to you that it doesn't look right for the only two persons in the state of Texas to be running against each other in a congressional district from the same party to be of African ancestry. In the proposed map, 38 districts, two African Americans running against each other in the proposed map.
You've claimed that this map was drawn blind to race. Is that correct?
That is the absolute truth, as God is my witness.
So in fact, when we had our committee discussion on September 24th, you told me, and I quote this today, to this day, I have not looked at any racial data.
Correct.
When we met before you released the proposed Senate plan, I showed you a map of SD10 showing colored shading. In fact, I showed you a number of maps that were shading maps where the district's minority populations were located, and you initialed every single one of those maps with the date on it. Is that correct?
Senator Powell, no, we're gonna to take you to task on this one, because you and I both know I made it perfectly clear that I was not considering racial data. You sat down and you handed me a document. I glanced at it for less than a second. I did not know what it was. When I turned the page, I realized it had racial data. I turned it over flat and I said, I will not look at this. You had 4 others. No, I'm going to finish. And I had you initial it. I initialed it. I put it into a folder. My staff did not look at it. I did not look at it. And I turned that folder over to the Attorney General's office, okay? You're the one who gave it to me.
That is correct.
Did not look at it. I did not read it. And I did not glean one bit of information from it. So I'm trying to be very transparent here, completely honest, but you need to be so too.
Oh, I am being honest.
Okay, well,
I
just
am
want to
being
make it
honest.
clear.
I absolutely laid those in front of you, and we dated them and initialed us. Both of us did.
Correctly, yes.
All right.
No one has been harmed more by map manipulation and voter suppression than Black and Latino communities, whose voices have been minimized at the ballot box and in Congress.
Minority communities in Fort Bend have grown substantially and exponentially. I mention this because the maps this body have authored do not reflect this growth. Unfortunately, your maps continue to neglect the rapid growth of minority communities as they have faced through decades of closed-door decision-making. These decisions are decided by the same lawmakers whose incumbencies are contingent on how the district boundaries are set up. Voters should decide their politicians. Politicians do not need to be deciding their voters.
I have not looked at that data because, again, I drew race blind, so that was not part of the data I considered when drawing the maps.
The census shows a 95% growth rate in Texas among African American, Latino, and AAPI communities. These numbers don't even include the known undercounting of Latino and minority populations in the census data. So the current data being used to draw these maps is understated.
Most of the growth that has occurred in this state is in minority communities, particularly in the Hispanic community. If you are producing a just state map, state Senate map that will meet the standards of the Voting Rights Act, you should be drawing a plan with more minority opportunity districts, not less.
Acting the proposed map dilutes the voting power of SD10 and will result in wasted legal fees paid by taxpayers.
You would agree that districts 8, 9, and 17 in the current map are among the districts where minority voters are on the verge of electing their preferred senators. And in fact, minority preferred candidates like President Biden carried those districts. That's 8, 9, and 17.
Know nothing about that. I have not looked at those numbers, and I don't agree with you. Don't know those numbers.
The destruction of a functioning crossover district is in violation of the U.S. Constitution.
So what have we done again, you may ask? Allow me to quote the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She said, quote, "Racial discrimination in elections in Texas is no mere historical artifact. To the contrary, Texas has been found in violation of the Voting Rights Act in every redistricting cycle from and after 1970, end quote. A perfect 5 of the past 5 redistricting cycles, Texas has been found in violation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
The break between the districts runs down the Brazos River through Waco, essentially cutting off and disenfranchising the African American community in East Waco.
I don't believe Section 5 is still applicable law. We did follow all current laws and the Constitution of the United States and Texas.
We were worried that their data would be weaponized for other reasons, and right now it is being weaponized as a way to crack them in half so that they would not be represented adequately. We are entitled to our representation, to have our needs addressed, and when they aren't, we are entitled to hold our officials accountable by voting against them. We need districts where politicians must earn votes through public service and community solutions.
These maps unfairly, I'll just put it like that, unfairly increase the power of older, white, rural areas, when Texas is increasingly, overwhelmingly, the population growth is younger, non-white urban dwellers. I don't know how anyone can perceive that to be fair.
So it's hard for me to understand, and maybe you can explain it to me, how it came to be that you didn't have any racial data before you, yet you somehow randomly came up with a district plan in which minority populations increased in districts where Anglo control is safely established, and those same minority populations decreased in districts where minority voters either controlled or were close to controlling their electoral results.
I drew the maps blind to race.
So, again, is blind to race just by chance or coincidence that you have drawn a map that disenfranchises majority minority voters?
Well, I disagree with your assessment of how I drew the map. I told you I drew blind to race, and that is what I did.
All right, does it concern you at all that minority voters constituted nearly all of the population increase in Texas over the past decade? And you heard from many of them during the process, yet you've drawn a plan that reduces the number of districts in which minority voters can elect their preferred candidates.
I do not know that to be the case. I don't agree with that statement.
Does it concern you then that Tarrant County is majority minority, yet your plan provides 0 Senate districts in which Tarrant County minority voters would ever elect their candidate of choice?
I have followed the law. I drew blind to race. I believe the maps I've drawn are compliant under the Voting Rights Act.
Major populations around Fort Worth, Dallas, Harrison, Fort Bend, Travis, and Williamson County, Coastal Bend, of minorities that are negatively affected by the map.
That Senate Bill 4 does a disservice to the Asian American community by splitting us even further.
Based on the growth of our minority population, who would be attempting to draw any new majority minority districts that might be required under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act?
I believe that the maps that are before you and have been presented are currently in compliance with the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act under Section 2.
And can you tell us how the white population grew in Harris and Fort Bend counties?
I don't know. I've not looked at that data.
We deserve to have fair and equitable representation from those who are part of our communities themselves.
They may not know the details of the Voting Rights Act and the civil rights movement here, but they do know that this is supposed to be a country where your race doesn't determine how much your vote counts. They may have never read or heard of even Reynolds versus Sims, but they think that one person, one vote is a principle of this country that people who serve in legislatures honor. When I look at these maps, that is not what I see.
It even splits the city of Corpus Christi along racial lines.
Not one redistricting map has been in compliance of the Voting Act since it was passed in 1965 by President Lyndon B. Johnson.
Because this map was drafted without regard to race and also underwent a legal compliance check, I'm confident that the proposed plan reflects all new growth in a manner that complies with all applicable law.
Texas must carefully consider questions about whether minority groups are politically cohesive and whether they have an ability to elect. And in this regard, politics is not an excuse. This may be the defense, but the reality is that in Texas, people are well aware that there is much racially polarized voting, and that if you're targeting heavily Democratic areas, you are likely targeting in most of the state heavily minority areas. So, the idea that somehow not considering race but only considering politics is an excuse just does not fly.
Bartlett specifically states that nothing in Section 2 grants special protection to a minority group's rights to form political coalitions.
The proposed map intentionally, unnecessarily, and illegally destroys the voting strength of District 10's minority citizens.
Some are intentionally trying to silence our voices.
I don't agree with that analysis. You can present it. I'll accept that you're presenting it.
Do you have any reason to think that I'm wrong about it?
I don't think the numbers show that, but maybe it's just terminology that's different.
In the new Senate plan that you have proposed, the number of majority-minority districts by voting age population actually has decreased now from 16 to 15. Do you have any reason to believe that I'm wrong about that?
I don't think we're speaking the same language. Are you talking about protected minority opportunity districts under the Voting Rights Act, or are you talking about something else?
I'm just talking about our census data.
Well, then I don't know.
Okay.
I heard Chair Huffman say the maps were drawn in essentially a colorblind way. In a state as diverse as Texas, the Constitution of the United States, the 14th and 15th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act don't permit that kind of willful blindness. The voting power, the ability of persons of color to elect representatives of their choice has to be considered to make sure that the power is not diluted, that voting power is not diluted by the way district lines are drawn. If this committee was not aware until yesterday that SB 4 abridges the voting power of persons of color, you are on notice now. It has been described to you in specific detail by a number of witnesses, and I'm sure there'll be even more today. So if you proceed with a map like SB 4 without protecting the constitutional and statutory rights of persons of color, it will be fair to presume that you have done so intentionally.
Public testimony of the committees previous 2 weeks ago and yesterday. I just don't understand how these maps could be presented when the majority of the public testimony directed this committee to protect minority coalition interests, to adhere to the Voting Rights Act, and to protect our communities of interest with compact districts.
As I said, we drew them race blind, and after they were drawn, we sent them for a compliance, and they were determined, the map was determined to comply with the Voting Rights Act.
There are genuine concerns about the constitutionality of these maps. It appears that, as in previous cycles, there are patterns of packing and cracking of Black, Latinx, and AAPI communities across the state.
I'm the son of the segregated South. The rights recognized in the Constitution for me were denied to me by my neighbors. I'm a 74-year-old African-American male. I had to sit in the back of the bus. I entered back doors. I drank from colored water fountains. I know what invidious discrimination looks like. I've had the KKK to burn a cross in my yard. I know what it sounds like. I've been called names that I don't repeat. I know what it feels like to have gone to a segregated school and had to overcome inferiority by virtue of simply being segregated from the broader society. Understanding all of these things,